An old man stood at the cafe, until the Special Forces salute illuminated a forgotten honor. Before we begin, share in the comments which city you're watching this video from today. It was an unusually cool August morning in 1925 in the small, forgotten town of San Angelo, Texas. The dusty cobblestones of the main street were still damp from the light rain that had fallen overnight. Shopkeepers had half opened their shutters, trying to adjust to the lazy air of the new day. Meanwhile, at the corner of the street, in front of the old brick cafe, stood a man the townsfolk barely noticed. His name was Hank Dawson. Few in the town knew him. To most, he was just a quiet figure who occasionally appeared in front of the cafe, drawing attention with his silence, his face etched with the marks of time. He wore a faded, slightly worn military uniform. On its chest was a medal, dusted by years but still gleaming. On his left arm, a tattoo of an eagle with its wings spread wide stood out, worn like its owner's gaze, yet proud. The townsfolk would occasionally whisper to each other. He must be an old soldier. But from which war? No one knew for sure. Hank left questions unanswered, often walking away without a single word. He simply stood in front of the cafe, listening to the aroma of coffee and the faint jazz music drifting from inside. That morning, however, the air was anything but ordinary. Gray clouds moved slowly across the sky, and the wind scattered the town's dust and the silent memories of the past. Hank, hands clasped behind his back, stared into the distance. The lines on his face were traces of a man who had seen too much and wished to forget just as much. It was just past 9 when a stir began in front of the cafe. In the distance, at the other end of the street, a group of men in gleaming uniforms appeared. Their steps were heavy but disciplined. Rifles on their shoulders, heads held high, faces serious. The townsfolk didn't understand what was happening at first. Women peered from their shop doorways, and children lined the sidewalk, whispering. Suddenly, the group stopped in front of Hank. Their uniforms bore a foreign insignia, their belts gleaming with polished buckles. Without a word, they lined up and stood at attention in a salute. The street fell silent. Only the hum of the wind could be heard. A faint smile appeared on Hank's face. He slowly brought his hand to the medal on his chest. At that moment, the inscription on the medal glinted in the sunlight, 1944. The townsfolk exchanged stunned glances. That date evoked the bloodiest, darkest days of World War II. Lily, the young waitress at the cafe, watched the scene from behind the counter. The coffee cup in her hand trembled, as a single question stuck in her mind. Who is this old man? After that unexpected event, the brief smile on Hank's face lingered in Lily's mind. This old man, who had passed silently by the cafe for years, had suddenly earned the respect of soldiers in the middle of town, carrying a medal inscribed with 1944. Lily knew she wouldn't sleep until she uncovered the story behind that medal. After the cafe closed, she walked to the town's small, dusty archive building with a cup of coffee and a notebook in hand. She navigated through yellowed newspapers, rusty file boxes, and forgotten typewriter pages on the old wooden shelves. The elderly archive clerk looked over his glasses and asked, "What are you looking for at this hour, Lily?" Hesitantly, Lily said, "Henry Dawson." "Anything about 1944? The clerk shook his head and disappeared among the shelves. He returned with a thin, worn file. When Lily opened it, she found a copy of a war report. The report described a life-or-death struggle to hold a critical bridgehead in the European theater. The unit was led by Sergeant Henry Dawson. Details revealed that Dawson held his position for 36 hours, with ammunition nearly depleted, enabling over 200 soldiers to retreat safely. As Lily's eyes scanned the lines, another detail caught her attention: the soldier with an eagle tattoo on his arm fought at the forefront throughout the resistance. This matched Hank's tattoo perfectly. As Lily closed the file, the pieces hidden for years began to come together in her mind. So it was him, standing at that bridge, she whispered. The next morning, the air was still cool. Passing by the cafe, Lily saw Hank in his usual spot. His uniform was a bit more neatly pressed, the metal on his chest gleaming brightly. Lily took a deep breath and approached him. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that medal. Did you defend a bridge in 1944? Hank, leaning on his cane, paused. A moment of silence followed. Then he tapped the tip of his cane lightly on the sidewalk and turned his gaze to Lily's eyes. There was no anger in his face, only deep weariness. "Yes," he said, his voice calm like the wind but heavy, "but that victory isn't celebrated with fanfare, it lives in silence. Because behind every medal, there are those who didn't return." Lily, swallowing hard, asked, "Were you that sergeant?" Hank didn't answer. He simply bowed his head, his eyes drifting to a distant point. At that moment, even the tone of the wind blowing through the town square seemed to change. A few passers-by stopped, as if sensing an invisible truth coming to light, and exchanged glances. Now everyone knew, Hank wasn't just a quiet old man, he was a true war hero tucked away in the margins of history books. Yet, he had clearly chosen to bear the weight of that heroism in silence for a lifetime. From that day on, Lily began to watch Hank more closely. Every morning at the same time, he appeared in front of the cafe, leaning on his cane, staring at a corner of the main street. The lines on his face carried not just the fatigue of years but the resilience of a soldier still standing guard on a battlefield. Though his shoulders were slightly stooped, the sharpness in his gaze betrayed what he had seen in the past. Lily was determined not to let this curiosity go. One day, during a coffee break, she approached the town sheriff. "What do you know about Mr. Dawson?" she asked. The sheriff looked up from his paperwork and gave the young woman a glance. He paused, a cautious expression crossing his face. "Henry Dawson. A retired soldier. Quiet, keeps to himself. He's been in town for years, but no one's pried into his past." When Lily mentioned the medal and the soldier's salute, the sheriff's eyes widened slightly. "An eagle tattoo, you say? Are you sure?" Lily nodded. The sheriff took a deep breath. "What we've heard, he defended a bridge in Europe back in the day. But the details were always incomplete. Records were either lost or never opened." This unfinished story only fueled Lily's curiosity further. That night, after closing, she returned to the town's archive building. Among the old files were yellowed World War II documents, faded photographs, and sealed reports. She began examining them one by one. After hours of searching, she found the key piece she was looking for. In a 1944 war report, it was written that a small bridge in the European theater was under enemy fire. The bridge was a critical passage point. If the enemy captured it, hundreds of soldiers would be trapped. The report stood out with these lines: "Sergeant Henry Dawson, leading the unit, never abandoned his position. For 36 hours under heavy fire, with ammunition nearly gone, he defended the bridge. This resistance allowed over 200 soldiers to retreat safely." On another page, a soldier was commemorated. The sergeant with an eagle tattoo on his arm stood at the forefront. Rain, mud, bullets. Nothing moved him. Lily's mind flashed to Hank's tattoo. Now all the pieces were coming together. But one question remained unanswered: why had such a hero chosen to stand silently in front of a cafe in a small town years later? After all that fame and recognition, why had he chosen silence? The next day, as Lily passed by the cafe, Hank was in his usual spot. Leaning on his cane, his eyes were lost in the horizon. Lily approached hesitantly. "Mr. Dawson," she said softly, "I know you now. You were the sergeant who defended that bridge, weren't you?" Hank turned his head, his eyes briefly meeting the young woman's. Then, looking into the distance, he said, "Sometimes victory is just the burden of those who survive." Lily realized in that moment that Hank's silence wasn't forgetfulness, it was his way of carrying the weight of the past. And perhaps his standing in front of the cafe was a way of continuing to keep watch over the bridge he had defended years ago. The story Lily uncovered spread through the town in whispers. First a few curious customers, then neighboring shopkeepers, and eventually the local newspaper's reporter. Everyone began to learn that the old man standing quietly in front of the cafe was a true war hero. A figure once overlooked and shadowed was now under a new light. The town's perspective changed. People no longer just greeted Hank, they bowed their heads in respect. Even the Special Forces soldiers, when they returned to the town, stood silently before him in salute. One afternoon, the cafe door opened with the sound of a cane tapping. The man who entered, gray-haired and still standing tall, was another retired soldier. His name was George. His face bore the lines of time, but his eyes held a familiar spark. A silence fell over the cafe. George approached the table where Hank sat. "Henry Dawson?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Hank looked up, squinting at him. "That's me." George took a deep breath. "You saved me on that bridge in 1944. At that moment, Lily's throat tightened. George recounted how Hank refused to abandon his post under a hail of bullets, carried wounded soldiers on his back, and even when ammunition ran out, defended the bridge with just a pair of binoculars and his courage. As he spoke, the silence in the cafe gave way to murmurs of awe. These stories touched the heart of the town. A week later, the municipality and locals made a joint decision: a ceremony would be held for Hank. On the day of the ceremony, the main street was adorned with flags, and a red carpet was laid in front of the cafe. Hank wore his old uniform, his medal gleaming proudly on his chest. Leaning on his cane, he stepped out the door to a crowd lining the street, greeting him with applause. The Special Forces soldiers stood ready at the ceremony site. They saluted Hank, standing at attention before him. The sheriff stepped to the microphone and said, "San Angelo honors its hero today," prompting enthusiastic applause from the crowd. After the ceremony, Lily approached Hank with a small piece of paper. On it was written a single sentence: "The town is proud of your victory." Hank took the note and stared at it silently for a long time. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips. "Maybe the eagle rises here too," he said. From that day on, the townsfolk called him the Eagle of the Café. When the National Museum asked Hank to donate his memorabilia, he gave only his uniform and the binoculars he never parted with during the war. These two items were placed in one of the museum's most visited corners. At the end of the ceremony, an old soldier, leaning on his cane, took the stage. His voice trembled, his eyes welling up. "You saved my life," he said. Hank couldn't hold back the emotions he had suppressed for years. His eyes grew misty, and he nodded slightly. And the story was etched into memory with a question echoing through the crowd: have you ever known someone like Hank? The forgotten hero of the cafe?